Hello everyone and welcome to our discussion today about how complaints can and ideally should improve regulatory practice. Before we start, we've got a lot of participants from different parts of the world on the call today, so I really want to begin by first acknowledging First Peoples that are here today and pay my respects to them and their elders, past, present and emerging. For me, I'm coming from Wurundjeri country, and I particularly want to acknowledge a deep personal connection that many of our Indigenous communities here in Australia have to the land and to country. My name's Adam Beaumont. I'm a director at With Purpose Consulting. I'm one of the founders of the National Regulators Community Practice, so it's a little bit of pride that I see how far we've come in a short period of time. So it's great to see so many people joining us today. This is the 8th webinar for this year and the 25th webinar since COVID. So there you go. So COVID has caused us to pivot a little bit, and so welcome to today's session. Before I begin and introduce the panel, I thought I'd do a little bit of housekeeping. For those that are familiar with the webinars that we run, then you'll have some idea about how these work. For those that aren't that familiar, we record these conversations, so they're all available on ANZOG's YouTube channel. It generally takes us a couple of weeks to get them up there, but this will be up there in a couple of weeks, and the last 14 months of webinars are also there. So should you want to have a look at some of the previous conversations, feel free to jump in there and have a bit of a look. Today's session is very much a discussion and a conversation around complaints and how we can use those to be better regulators. To aid that conversation, I want to ask you to contribute, and you can do that through the Slido channel. You can do that by going to your device and typing in sli.do. And if you use the hashtag complaints, you'll be able to jump on and see what's going on. Feel free to ask questions. You could also upvote other questions if you think that's a good question and you want to get it asked. Click the magic button. I'll be monitoring it as we go, and I'll do my best to include it as part of the conversation. So first, I want to introduce our speakers for today and our panelists who will support us in the conversation. The first is Nicole Lawless. Nicole's the acting New South Wales Deputy Ombudsman, has been since August 2020. She leads the complaints and the investigations branch. They're responsible for a whole lot of stuff, including handling inquiries and complaints and youth justice notifications, undertaking monitoring activities and investigations. Nicole's had a pretty varied career, so she's been with the New South Wales Office of Department of Public Prosecutions, the Attorney General's Department in New South Wales. She was a policy advisor with DPC around prevention of violence against women, and she represents facts at the Royal Commission into the institutional response to child sex abuse. So welcome, Nicole. Look forward to throwing some questions your way and inviting others to do the same. Our next panelist is Andrew Gavriliotis. Andrew is the Executive Director of Community Engagement at the New South Wales Department of Customer Service. He's got 30 years experience in consumer protection and regulatory services and delivery. This includes senior exec roles with fair trading, safe work, liquor and gambling. And those roles are quite extensive, you know, in terms of assisting customers with regulatory complaints or stakeholder management or community engagement and digital development. So quite a varied career. He's previously held responsibility for strategic management of New South Wales Fair Trading Centre in terms of the contact centre and complaint services and licensing and regulation of real estates and residential bonds. So Andrew's going to bring a lot of knowledge and wisdom from on-ground regulatory practice. And Andrew, thanks so much for taking the time to join us. So in terms of how we're going to run today, as I said, very much a conversation, and again, inviting you to, through the Slido channel, contribute any questions you have. We really want to focus on how regulators can better harness intelligence that comes from complaints to get better at what we do, managing harms and minimising harms. Complaints is a big area, so we just want to start the conversation today. We're not going to conclude it, but to help, we've got a mind map that we've drawn up that goes a little bit to the range of areas where complaints can be useful. So we'll bring that up on the screen now. Just also being mindful that this will be available later. So if you're staring at the screen going, oh, geez, there's a lot in this, it'll be on ANZOG's website a bit later, so you'll be able to come back and have a look at it. So when we think about complaints, and for the purposes of our conversation today, we can kind of divide it into different areas. There's the whole ethos about how do we manage complaints? How do we improve complaints management? What is best practice complaints management? How do we encourage complaints or avoid being too complaints driven or reactive? There's enabling accessibility. How do we support people to make complaints? To some degree, how do we encourage them to make future complaints or improve complaints quality? There's also encouraging tip-offs. How do we encourage duty holders and staff of duty holders to make complaints that give us intelligence that's useful to narrow and focus our energy and efforts on different harms or different areas where service quality perhaps is not as high as it could be? Equally, how can we use complaints to really improve regulatory practice and regulatory delivery? How can we better understand the regulatory experience of businesses and individuals that we regulate, or understand the impact of our decisions on them, or understand how well our officers are performing out there in the real world? And then there's a big one around how do we use complaints as a vehicle for intelligence, both to improve risk-based compliance planning, where we target, how we profile, where we look, where we spend very precious and scarce regulatory resource, to improve our response activity. How do we better triage? Where do we choose to respond to first? How do we tailor responses in a way that makes us more efficient and effective? Or identifying areas of non-compliance. How do we know what's going on out there? How do we use complaints to give us a sense of what's important, what's not important, what people are seeing? And how do we use complaints to validate self-reporting, or indeed tell a performance story about how well we're managing the harms that we care about or doing the job that we're tasked with doing? So this mind map is just sort of a starter flavor, if you like. It'll be available on ANZOC's website. Feel free to have a look at it. But I want to jump straight into it. So Nicole, I'm going to put you on the spot and get us started. Nicole, why even have a complaint system? What's the benefit and purpose of complaints?
Thanks, Adam. Excuse me. It's a good question. Why do complaints actually matter? And I think as a starting point, it's important to note that the right to complain about unreasonable or unfair treatment or suboptimal service delivery is a fundamental right of a democracy, and we live in a democracy. But there's some actually really practical and important purposes that complaints can provide, particularly for agencies or for service delivery entities. That includes some really obvious ones, such as effectiveness. It provides good information about the effectiveness of the service that you're delivering. It also helps to identify aspects that need improvement, contributes to better customer satisfaction, understand why customers might be dissatisfied with the service. It also ensures that customers have a way to be reassured that the agency in question is committed to addressing and resolving problems as they arise. It also improves the agency or the organisation's transparency and accountability, again, a really important feature. And I think in the context that we're talking about today with regulatory agencies as well, it provides extra data so that you can assess and determine an agency's strengths, weaknesses, and importantly, potential compliance risks. I think the combination of a good complaints management program within an agency as well as a good complaints management system can actually serve as a really good early warning system that lets an agency know when they're actually at risk of regulatory action. I'd also like to add that from an external review perspective or an external complaint handler perspective, which is what we are at the New South Wales Ombudsman, as well as we do receive complaints about us, but predominantly it's complaints about New South Wales government agencies and some community service providers, that provides another opportunity for issues that may not have arisen in the first instance to be surfaced, other issues and risks that might not be readily apparent to the agency in question. It also, at times, from an external review perspective, can provide complainants with reassurance that the agency in question is actually acting reasonably or consistently in the circumstances. So I'll stop there and see if you've got any other questions for me.
Andrew, I'm going to come to you in a second, so if I can get you to unmute and prepare. But Nicole, before I throw to Andrew, like when we talk about complaints, presumably there's good principles of practice that comes to complaints management. Can you give us an idea about what that looks like or what that means?
Absolutely. So there are quite a number of good principles of complaint handling in New South Wales we actually developed what we call the Complaint Handling Improvement Program, which is has been adopted by secretaries of New South Wales agencies in New South Wales. Those principles, though, are essentially applicable to any agency, and I would actually suggest that individuals, if they're interested, can go and have a look on our website at the Complaint Handling Improvement Program principles, which is called CHIP for short. Essentially, what those principles are respectful treatment, information and accessibility, good communication, taking ownership, timeliness and transparency. So if those principles are applied, and there's, as I said, a lot more information on our website about what those individually mean, generally speaking, whether it's a public service agency, a community service provider, any agency, if you apply those principles, you're pretty much guaranteed to have a good process for dealing with your complaints.
Andrew, can I bring you into this? Because, you know, when you hear the term complaints, and you've had quite a varied regulatory career, what are you hearing? What are complaints meaning to you as a regulator?
So I hear two different things. I hear the complaints that Nicole is talking about, and I think they're really important because they go to how we deliver a service, how we actually engage with the public. So certainly that's really important, and we encourage feedback to come back to us about that. However, as a regulator, what I hear is a complaint is a regulatory complaint or a complaint about a third party. So a variety of, consumers, if it's in the fair trading world, or workers, if it's in the safe work world, or people who go to licensed premises, they may all come to us and complain, but they're not complaining about the Better Regulation Division in New South Wales, of which I'm part of. They're actually complaining about a trader, an employer, or a licensed premises. So we look at complaints that we need to intervene in. So that's kind of a very different view of a complaint, but one that's not uncommon amongst regulators. So our focus then becomes, how do we best actually receive those complaints, and how do we then best manage those complaints? So we go from, for example, we receive about 100,000 complaints annually in New South Wales. How do we best respond to those complaints? And that's the question that we ask. And then how do we actually use those complaints to provide us with an insight into what's happening in the marketplace? Complaints very much are the canary in the coal mine for us.
It's interesting, in my experience working for and with regulators, one thing that can often happen is that, in the example you're giving where, complaints are about duty holders, people who you're trying to regulate or manage, you can get a weird, perverse situation where the regulator gets frustrated at the complainants, and the job is about managing the complainants, not managing the harm that's leading them to complain in the first place. Nicole, there is often talk about unreasonable complainants and how that can impact, the attitude and view and value of complaints that are received. When you think about unreasonable complainants, what do you think? What does that mean to you?
We actually have a definition of what an unreasonable complaint behaviour is, and it's important to focus on the behaviour rather than the individual. The definition that we use at the Ombudsman is any behaviour by a person which, because of its nature or frequency, raises substantial health, safety, resource or equity issues for the people involved in the complaint process. How does that manifest itself? It can be a variety of ways. Excuse me. It can be unreasonable persistence, and I'm sure people have come across this before. These are people that persist with an issue even when the complaint has been finalised or when there's been a final decision that they just refuse to accept. Excuse me. It can also manifest in unreasonable demands. It might be a complainant that says, I want, some massive amount of compensation to address my issue, which is just completely and utterly unjustified. It could also be that they just keep moving the goalposts. They want this on one occasion and then the goalposts move and then they demand something else. It can also be manifested as a lack of cooperation. So, for example, we talk about smart complaining at the Ombudsman, and we encourage people to make smart complaints, including providing relevant information and being honest and so on. Sometimes you'll get complainants that, despite that advice, just refuse to provide all the relevant information. They might drip feed. They might only provide you with information that suits their purposes rather than the whole story. They can be really disorganised, sometimes excessive information, so above and beyond what's actually necessary, death by information. And the final way that people, I think, would be particularly familiar with is unreasonable behaviours. So that's where you have complainants who might show extreme anger, aggression, threats, sometimes violent behaviour. So there's a whole raft of different ways that unreasonable complaint conduct can manifest itself or behaviour.
It's interesting. I imagine there's lots of people on the call going, yeah, geez, we get some unreasonable complaints. Andrew, question to you. How do you stop, or how in the past have you managed the situation to avoid this sort of negative culture towards complainants? How have you managed that?
So to respond to that, and seeing Nicole's on the line, we actually absolutely follow the Ombudsman's guidelines, which is the response to that one. I think that sometimes we need to put this into perspective. Yes, there are unreasonable complainants, but it is a really small minority. It is actually not the bulk of the work that we have to do. And usually when you have an unreasonable complainant, everyone knows about it because it's such a small number, and we're talking like really small numbers. The important thing is, as Nicole said, you actually look at the actual issue at hand and you try and manage that. And if you do that, then I think you're on a pretty good footing to try and resolve the matter to the satisfaction of the complainant. However, certainly if people come and are constantly persistent, if they start displaying particularly aggressive behaviour, then there are ways that will follow the guidelines to actually shut them off, basically. But the important thing is to make sure that you actually look at the actual issue that they're presenting. That's a really important thing to take into consideration.
Oh, I was just going to add to what Andrew just said. I think that there are strategies that you can put in place even before you get to the point where somebody's being unreasonable, and that starts with managing expectations of all people that come to you, but particularly complainants. So if you can manage that from the beginning and make sure that the expectations are realistic, that helps. One of the biggest triggers for somebody going from dissatisfied or unhappy into unreasonable is that the expectations haven't been managed and they're not met. As well as insisting on respect and cooperation, and also giving respect to the individual, regardless of how bad their behaviour might be. Having policies, actually having unreasonable complainant conduct policies within your office so that staff have a really clear understanding of how they can deal with these individuals, as well as how to escalate and when they need support from somebody more senior. And I think finally, it's really important to point out that most unreasonable complainants, even if they're acting badly, it doesn't necessarily mean that they don't have a well-founded complaint. And if you need to manage the behaviour, you only manage it to the extent necessary to curtail the behaviour. And there's been, tribunal decisions as well around, agencies taking excessive measures to manage someone's behaviour. For example, depriving somebody access to a public service quite broadly, and that's completely inappropriate. That said, there will be times when the strategies don't work, the managing expectations don't work, the stress and the disproportionate impact that's having on your resources has to be managed in a more direct kind of way. And they will be things like strategies are restricting access to only certain members of staff, restricting the issues that a complainant can discuss with the regulator or with the oversight body, or the agency in question, restricting how contact can be made. And this is one that can be quite effective. For example, restricting people to emails only, they can't call, or can only call on certain days, or if it's really bad, snail mail. That can be quite effective. Or, putting limits, conditions upon people. So saying, for example, we will take your phone call, but it's a maximum of 5 minutes. Yeah. So it's kind of really about focusing people, I suppose, on what's really important.
Nicole,
sorry.
Well, I've got you, because you're talking like a lot of this in terms of systems and structures. That sounds quite sensible. Like there's a great question in the slider here around, well, what skills do you recruit for in complaints teams? And Andrew, I'll come to you in a second on the same question, but for you, Nicole, where have you seen this done well? What do you recruit for to get good quality complaints teams?
I think for me, it's about compassion. A lot of people who might fall into this category have mental illness at times or come from a different cultural background. And it's about understanding that, sometimes and often there could be, an underlying, without trying to, be a psychologist or understand what that is necessarily. It's just being empathetic and compassionate to staff. To people that are falling into this category. It's also about being calm, not surprisingly, being calm and being able to remove yourself, I guess, from what might feel quite personal at the time, but to understand that this isn't about you necessarily. It's the conduct of the individual that's the problem, not you. I think as well, so that's kind of your frontline stuff, but the other thing that's super, super important is having supportive management. And we talk quite a lot about this. We deliver training as well as we've got a manual that deals with this, as Andrew mentioned before. But we talk about the fact that it can't just be frontline staff that are responsible for this. It is a whole of organisation or a whole of agency approach to dealing with, even though they are a small percentage, when they get going, they can take a massive amount of resources. So it has to be a whole of organisation approach from the top through management down to your frontline staff, so that frontline staff, if they are dealing with somebody difficult, they know that they can go to their supervisor and their supervisor has their back, or that their supervisor can, it's called double jacking, where a supervisor, if it's a phone call, can actually jack into that phone call and listen and intervene if they need to. So there's a whole bunch of strategies. But I think as far as, personal traits, it's, sounds obvious, remain calm under pressure, be empathetic, be compassionate, and be able to seek help when you need it, be able to put your hand up and say to your supervisor, I need some assistance.
Andrew, you've run contact centres and complaint services, and is it hard to get people who fit that bill? Is it hard to fill those roles?
I think there are a lot of people out there who are actually absolutely committed to providing assistance to people, having a really strong customer service work ethic. So we tend to actually get quite significant numbers applying for roles when we do have them. What we do find is the similar traits that Nicole mentioned, but what we do actually find is people do come into work for us to manage those regulatory complaints, and if they are the right personality type, they tend to be with us for a very long time, so they become really experienced. And if they're not, they're gone very quickly by their own choice, I might add. So I think it is people who are focused on wanting to provide assistance, to intervene for members of the community, particularly those more vulnerable. That's certainly true. And of course, and I suppose it's open to anybody to put in a complaint into our service, but certainly we're fairly focused where there is vulnerability. I just wanted to pick up on one of the points that Nicole made about managing expectations. I think that that's really important, and we've had to have a real shift in terms of how we manage those expectations. I mean, we've gone from a couple of years ago managing say 60,000-70,000 complaints annually to managing 100,000 on an annual basis. Resources are finite; that didn't come with additional resources, so we had to we had to develop an approach that was going to still meet our obligation to intervene in complaints, but also establish some ways of actually telling customers that we can't intervene in everything that we do. So really what we have done in recent times is introduced a strong triage approach using a matrix which really looks at harms, both so we can actually identify those low harms and therefore have a more minimal intervention, and making it clear to the customer that that's all our intervention will be, because the harm is minimal, and therefore focusing our resources on where there's greatest harm in relation to the regulatory environment that we work in. So that's our way of trying to sort of both provide some boundaries, if you like, for the complainants that come to us, but also really focusing our work to where it's most needed.
Can I pick up on that? Because triage is such an important part of managing that influx of complaints. And you talked a little bit about how you do that. What happens in the circumstances where a complainant has a legitimate complaint, but it's not within your regulatory remit, or it doesn't fit through the gates of, actually, we can't do much about that? How do you manage that circumstance? Because that's a tricky one.
Well, it is. I mean, I suppose at the end of the day, we are regulators and we have certain parameters that we work in. What we are very aware of, though, is that if there are other regulators who might be able to assist, or other agencies that might be able to assist, we will refer to those agencies and have close relationships with those agencies to make those referrals in a seamless way as possible. And then ultimately, there are some matters which just need to go to the New South Wales tribunal, basically to NCAT, and we will refer to the tribunal as well.
Nicole, can I bring you in on this one? Because one risk for regulators is that, and from the complainant's experience, they feel like they're getting handballed or bounced around or being ignored. Whereas for the regulator's perspective, they might legitimately going, you've got a legitimate complaint, but it's not with us. We're going to forward your complaint or pass your complaint on to someone else. What's some of the traps and risks that come with doing this? And how do you avoid negative publicity or the feeling from the individual that they're just getting passed from one department to another?
Yeah, I think that's a very legitimate concern. We are a creature of statute at the New South Wales Ombudsman. We have jurisdiction that's defined by statute. So we get a lot of people coming to us because they might just Google Ombudsman and they will come to us to make a complaint, but it will be completely outside of our jurisdiction. For example, it's a telecommunications issue, or it's energy and water, or it's a Commonwealth Ombudsman matter, as well as people that make complaints to us that are actually in jurisdiction, but they haven't yet they haven't yet given the opportunity to the agency to address the issue. So firstly, I think it's about, going back to the expectations point, it's about ensuring that those complaints, those misdirected complaints, don't come to you in the first place. So it's about being very clear as far as your website goes, as far as any policies or documents that you have, that people understand what your remit is as a regulator or as an oversight body such as ours, so that people don't get disappointed when they come to you and they go, well, why can't you help me? The second point is, though, when they do come to you, and picking up on what Andrew said, it doesn't matter if they're not your direct customer, they should still be having a positive customer experience. And I think that's actually a role that we play pretty well. We actually do operate a little bit as a referral system at the New South Wales Ombudsman, because people just hear Ombudsman and come to us. What we've done is we've actually developed a direct referral system. And again, Andrew pointed out this with other regulators. We've developed this direct referral system with other agencies, which is pretty much most New South Wales government agencies now, where with the consent of the complainant, we can just refer their matter directly to that agency for them to have an opportunity in the first instance to try and address whatever the issue is. Then failing that, they can come back to us. Most complainants are relatively pleased that we play that role of directly referring, that they don't necessarily have to go and get back on the phone and wait or redo their email. But you will get those that are dissatisfied, and I think at the end of the day, all you can do is try and make sure that customer experience is as professional and as positive as possible for the recipient, because sometimes it's unavoidable that you will get those misdirected or inadvertent sort of contacts or complaints.
So this kind of goes to that earlier point around making it accessible, encouraging people encouraging complaints in the sense that it encourages more intelligence that you can use to harness, to channel towards your role. Like, there's a great question in the Slido, Nicole, around people legitimately, regulators want to get feedback on lots of different things. What's the line between feedback and complaints, and what's been your experience around this?
So there's a definition of what a complaint is, which is a dissatisfaction around service. So that's one thing, and it's something that you might have a legitimate expectation that something will be done about, versus feedback, which is often FYI, this was my experience and we just think you should know. And you're absolutely right, both of those are welcomed, and we're an oversight agency that obviously handles complaints about other agencies, but we get complaints about our service too. And that's fundamentally important for us to ensure that we continue to adapt, we continue to evolve, we continue to improve the way that we engage with our customers, as well as with our other key stakeholders, such as Andrew's organisation. So feedback is also important. Complaints where we have to, there's an expectation that we will do something about it, also important. I think that agencies in general, including ourselves, need to ensure that you essentially make it easy for people to complain, even though that may well, as Andrew pointed out, have impacts on your resourcing, particularly when it is finite. But if you are in the business of complaints, there again, particularly in the public service, there's a legitimate expectation and a right in many cases, particularly, people have a right to complain to the New South Wales Ombudsman, that you will make the ability to complain easy and accessible. And that's particularly true that when you're designing your complaint handling systems, you're not just designing it for people that would already find it easy to complain. You need to make sure that it's much broader and takes into account, people that have a disability, people that live in regional or remote areas, people, children and young people who again are a very different cohort to adults, older people, people from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So ensuring that when you're designing your systems, you think about all the various cohorts that might be coming to you and make it as accessible as possible.
Andrew, in terms of being accessible as possible, it sounds like, as you talked about earlier around triage, you're getting a volume of complaints where you're trying to manage those. I'm curious, going to the intelligence side of it, the concept of a surrogate regulator, complainants who have visibility of harms that you may not have, that gives you insights, intelligence, an early warning system. They're all really positive attributes. But how do you avoid being complaint-led and becoming overtly reactive?
I actually think it's been a really interesting past decade, if you like, the last 10 years. 10 years ago, if I was sitting here, I'd be talking about complaints being the most important thing in terms of driving the work that we do, driving where we should look to have our resources focused upon. As I said, we received about 100,000 complaints annually. Quite a number of those can be white noise in the sense of they're low harm and therefore can be distracting. So I think having a really sound triage model is important. Having a really good risk matrix to focus on where the greatest harm is and focusing resources is important. Rather than looking at them as an individual, for example, consumer complaint about a trader or a complaint about some other regulated industry, we need to actually aggregate those complaints and look at what is being complained about. Is it a specific trader? Is it a particular product that's in the marketplace or a particular practice in the marketplace, which will then help us further hone in on what the real harm is, and then focus our compliance resources, our enforcement resources on those particular harms. Having said that, 10 years ago, that would have been sort of one of our primary focuses, where we would look at those complaints. Nowadays, we've got access to so much intel, so much data. Complaints only form a part of that. It's not the total picture. And in a recent meeting, when we were looking at what our Intel team had been working on in the construction space, for example, and I'll just use it as an example because it kind of blew me away, is they were looking to identify where the greatest risk was in the construction sector, and they had access to data on more than 15,000 building sites in New South Wales, more than 200,000 organisations, 2 million plus people who were associated with the building and construction industry. And so overall, there were some 2 billion data points for this work. So while complaints were and are really important to the consumer, it is reactive, our response to that complaint. Whereas when you've got that other data giving you almost lead data, if you like, a big data that you can use to focus your compliance resources, that is really impactful. So complaints, yes, still important. As I said, the canary in the coal mine, but there's a whole lot of other data that we need to also use to really identify where we place our resources.
Nicole, I can see you wanting to jump in here, so I'm going to throw to you.
I do, thank you. I just wanted to add to that. I think Andrew is absolutely right. Complaint data is absolutely important for all the reasons that I said at the beginning, but they only tell part of that picture. And I think there's a real risk, especially if people focus on the number of complaints. And I think there's kind of two reasons for that. One is that it often only offers you one side of the customer experience. It's people who, notwithstanding what I just said about accessibility, it's often people who are passionate enough or have the time or the resources to be able to complain that do. And that's not necessarily the full picture. The other reason that I think it's a little bit misleading to focus on numbers is that rising numbers of complaints or a large number of complaints can actually mean that your system's working really well. For the reasons that we discussed before, you want to encourage complaints. So it's obviously indicative of an issue, but it doesn't necessarily mean that things are going badly. It can actually mean that your system is working quite well for you. And I think complaint, as Andrew said, complaint data itself is important, but it needs to be a more nuanced approach to trying to ascertain what, if there are systemic issues in particular, what those systemic issues are as one part of that picture. Others might be, forums or, customer surveys or, a variety of other strategies that you can use to get a bigger picture of what the underlying issues might be.
And if I can just add to that, I think one of the things that has driven us for a very long time is that our complaints tend to be about workload, output numbers, rather than actually focusing on what the real story is in terms, again, as a regulator, focusing on what's happening in the marketplace and actually wanting to understand the root cause to the problems, whether it's about a complaint about us or in our regulatory role, really sort of driving down to what is the root cause of people complaining to us.
So Andrew, on that point, to what degree then does the complaints data, and you gave that great example of other points of intelligence, to what degree does the complaints data fit into your compliance planning processes? Like how important is that in channeling where you put your effort in a proactive setting?
So our compliance people use the Intel information which they have, and that comes from analysts looking at the bigger data that they're able to have access to. But at the same time, we have a weekly meeting from our compliance area, from our complaints area and our compliance area to identify what are the priorities. And so that kind of drives how we work together, making sure that complaints don't fall through the gaps, and are there systemic issues that we need to be addressing rather than just the individual issues. Sure, the individual complaint will be managed as appropriate, of having gone through the triage, having gone through the risk matrix, but at the same time, there may be bigger issues which are the root to the problem, and we want to make sure our compliance staff are aware of it, and so we can actually manage that as well. Not to mention where you might jump immediately to enforcement if you're talking about defalcation of trust funds in the real estate industry, for example.
Yeah, there's a great point in here in the Slido chat around, if complaints, and it goes to a little bit to what you were saying, Nicole, about whether complaints are an impartial or balanced source of intelligence, or do they skew to a certain direction based on how accessible the complaint system is. Nicole, what's your, when you hear that statement, when you hear this idea that, well, maybe complaints aren't the pure source of intel, how do you respond to that? Is that something that you often come across?
Yes, absolutely. And I think for us as an oversight agency of public services, public service authorities in New South Wales, we kind of have a dual role. One is about the resolution of individual complaints, and that's one thing, and that's absolutely fundamental and important. And the important role that we play. But the other side of it is the investigation side of it. And I think that goes to that point, which is if you're investigating an issue, and particularly when it's a systemic issue, and if you pick up either that there is a variety of complaints that are starting to show a trend or a theme, or there's a particular emerging issue, being able to investigate that and bring an impartiality to it, and get different sources of information and evidence to validate or not validate that underlying original complaint. And we can also use our own motion powers, which means that we don't necessarily need to have an individual complaint. That's that other really important aspect to complaint management or to systemic issues, that it can't always just be that somebody's told you that this is the case, that you do need to interrogate, that you do need to bring that forensic lens to understanding what those root causes might be. And then after bringing that sort of impartial process to bear on the particular issue, make reports about it and feed that back to the agency that's affected.
Andrew, can I change gears a bit and ask you a slightly different question? We've had a good conversation around complaints management system and ensuring accessibility. We've talked a little bit about harnessing intelligence to direct regulatory effort. I want to move now to a discussion around improving regulatory delivery. As we talked about at the start, there's kind of two channels for complaints. Some are by third parties who you regulate. Others are complaints about you as the regulator. What's your experience been in using complaints to improve regulatory delivery, including complaints against officers or your organisation?
Well, there's a couple of things. One, yes, we do get complaints about us, and we do review those and respond to those fairly quickly. Again, it's trying to sort of look at any systemic issues that we may have in terms of how we go about doing our work, and we do review how we go about doing our work regularly. We also have units that if people are making a complaint in terms of a penalty notice that might have been issued, they can be reviewed. Those reviews actually are really important, because then that drives our operational policy and practice. So we certainly use that higher end complaint, if you like, where somebody's actually saying it's, a penalty notice has been unfairly issued, for example, or a license may not have been fairly withheld, or any one of those sorts of issues. And we certainly use that to identify, are there systemic issues? Can we change our operational policies or our practice as regulators? So very keenly focused on that.
And is that separation between complaints about you versus complaints about the people you regulate, is that managed differently within the organisation?
Well, in a sense, yes, it is. We have a specific unit that looks at that complaint about how our officers go about delivering a compliance service, for want of a better word. That is quite different. It's not matched through the same triage process at all. And there is obviously also at times a statutory response that must apply to people sort of complaining about being issued with a notice.
Nicole, can I bring you in on this one? This concept of unreasonable regulatory experiences, where an individual or a business who's being regulated, quite rightly, for whatever reason, says, actually, no, I think that is completely unreasonable the way the regulator has treated me. How often do you get those complaints? And when you do, how do you work with the regulator to manage them?
We do get them. Again, it depends. It depends what the actual complaint is or what the nature of the complaint is. We do try and resolve the vast majority of complaints that come to us, and that obviously will depend or rely on having discussions with the agency involved. We have regular liaison meetings with all of our sort of key agencies, where we try and highlight not always individual matters, but emerging trends and themes and so on, and build that relationship so that if we do engage with an agency about a particular complaint, we already have that pre-established relationship and I guess credibility to bring that issue to the regulator's attention. Most complainants actually just want their problem resolved. They don't necessarily want a full-blown investigation that takes a year to 2 years to complete. They just want that particular issue for them resolved. And so if we can, speak to and sort of broker, I guess, in some ways, a resolution for that individual with the agency, then that's a good outcome. We also have a power to conciliate under our Act, and depending again on the nature of what the complaint is, sometimes that's a really effective way to bring the parties into a room, put the issue on the table and get, agreement or discussion happening, and then agreement about the best way to resolve that matter.
It's not much use to the complainant if you start talking to them about the systemic issues and the policies and procedures that I spoke about earlier and how it sort of changes our practice, etc. Quite frankly, they don't care. The only thing that they care about is actually, can we resolve this particular issue that it impacts on me right now? The important thing is that we actually work towards resolving that specific issue that's come to us. However, it would be really remiss of us not to then go on and look at how we can improve our practice. Was it actually an error of a single officer that can be rectified, or was it because we have a practice that's in place that will see that error occur again and again, or that poor practice occur again and again? And yes, we need to do that work, but that's a behind the scenes piece of work for us. If we're thinking about the customer, then we need to resolve their issue and do it quickly.
Andrew, on that point, complaints teams are often quite separate to field teams or the regulatory teams. How do you bridge that connection so that the complaints teams or the contact centres can effectively convey that perhaps regulatory service delivery here isn't quite hitting the mark? How does that process work?
And look, to be totally open, there's a certain tension about telling people, telling our staff that you haven't done something well or appropriately. So there is that tension there. For us, the focus, though, is from a leadership perspective, is taking that individual issue and actually identifying, is it a training issue, for example, and therefore, in our space, for example, again, I'll just use that example, our safe work inspectors, we actually have a registered training organisation. So as we're training them, we actually pick up on the issues that we identify through that complaint process or appeals process, really, and we'll bring that into the training. We will look at our guidance material for our field staff and change that guidance material. So when they're out in the field and they're looking at how they might handle a particular matter, they've actually got written guidance which has been updated to take into account a problem that we may have had or an appeal that had been made about a previous matter which was similar. So that's how we actually bring it together. We look at what the issue is, we try and resolve for the customer. We then look at our policies, our procedures, and make sure we have the documents in place for our field staff to be able to rely on in terms of how they actually manage a particular matter. And then we also bring it into the training as well through our RTO.
Just a reminder to everyone on the webinar too that you can contribute questions in the Slido platform. As you will have noticed, I've been feeding them in, but really encourage you to throw a few more in there. There's a great question in here which I particularly like, talking about trying to differentiate between a rant and a legitimate complaint. Nicole, can I throw this one to you? Look, people have their pet peeves and their areas of focus and interest, and there's always an expectation. We've talked a little bit about that. But what's been your experience as part of the training that you've offered to help regulators separate or enable that separation between what someone might say is a rant versus what might be a substantive issue?
Sure. I think, again, that comes down to, your systems and to your training that you provide to your frontline staff in order to, weed out those ones that are just a rant. You need to train your staff, whatever, the regulatory spaces that you're operating in, to be able to distill or to discern as much as possible. Is there something to this, or is it just somebody having a rant? As Andrew said, and as I've said, everybody has finite resources, and you need to have that good, solid triaging process in order to determine whether or not that's something that you need to take up. In our case, we have, as I said before, we're a creature of statute. We have, quite defined things that we can and can't look at. We look at maladministration, essentially. We don't look at corrupt conduct, for example. That's ICAC. Other matters that are outside of our jurisdiction. So if somebody's, having a rant and it's not hitting those boxes, whatever those boxes are that you've put in place for your regulatory environment, then I think you safely assume it's a rant. Get to the thing about.
Yeah.
Sometimes it is blurry though, and often, you know, you need to, you know, try and listen, actively listen, I guess, for those key bits of information. And you know, I like using that actively listening process because it's about repeating back to the person. So am I understanding what you're saying is this? And I might need some more information from you about this. And it's sort of drawing it out of the rant to try and, you know, figure out, is that something that we need to take more action on?
There's also this challenge and dichotomy of certain regulators who regulation is one component of their business. They're a service delivery agent and they regulate, like a council or a water authority. There's a great question here from Nick around, you know, when you do have that dueling service delivery function plus regulatory function, how do you distill between legitimate service improvement, you know, complaints relating to service, and complaints relating to, you know, something that would warrant some sort of regulatory intervention? Andrew, can I throw that one to you? How have you seen or balanced up these competing demands when you are a service delivery agent and you've also got a regulatory function?
That's a great tension that I think that we deal with on a daily basis as a regulator, because at the end of the day, what you primarily want to see is compliance. So if you want to see compliance, where's your starting point? The starting point is really at the service delivery or the education level, where you actually want people to be aware of what their obligations are and what their responsibilities are. But there comes a point where there may be a breach that needs to be you know, intervened or actioned. So there is that type of tension. We tend to have staff that have separated responsibilities. So our staff generally who are managing a complaint or delivering a service directly are probably not the inspector that's conducting the compliance action. It's not as clear cut as that, I have to say. There are some grey areas. We have mediators who might mediate an automobile dispute with a motor dealer and a customer over a warrantable defect. They also have power to issue a penalty notice or a rectification order or a penalty notice. So there can be a bit of a tension there. Again, it's clear policies, clear procedures. So our staff are very much aware of, are you in a role of providing education? Are you in a role of mediating, or are you actually attending because you've identified a breach of legislation and therefore you're going in there as an absolute compliance officer? When
that complaint comes through, there's a great question here from Troy on the Slido. You know, you say that complaint comes from an anonymous source where you cannot do any follow-up or you can't seek to clarify or ask further questions. Should that be treated differently to when it comes from someone who's put their name out there, give me a call, happy to talk about it? Do you treat those things differently in that context?
So the answer is it depends. It depends on the harm that might be likely. If it's a complaint that comes in that you think that, you know, may well be harmful, well, you might well respond to it. We actually, again, I will use a safety at work, a work health and safety example. We actually have an app out there which is called Speak Up, which I really would encourage all of you to have a look at. So a Speak Up app actually allows people at workplaces to take a photograph and actually send it in to us anonymously. So we have staff then who will triage that complaint and actually identify whether it's minimal harm, low harm, and therefore we don't really need to get anyone out there very quick, to it requires immediate on the spot, you know, out on site inspection. So we do take those types of complaints where there is real harm can occur and respond to them immediately, whether they're anonymous or not.
Nicole, can I get your thoughts on that before we move to concluding comments? Like, how do you treat anonymous complainants?
Similar to Andrew, I think it depends what the complaint is. So say, for example, if you're a local government authority and it's a complaint about a pothole, that doesn't need to be necessarily an identified person. Similarly, it could be more nuanced than that. If you've got complaints about barking dog or a barking dog and there's only one dog in that vicinity, okay, again, probably not a problem. It's when they escalate into, more Andrew uses the word harm or more seriousness, that it can be an issue, because often without further information or without understanding who made the complaint, it can be difficult to action that complaint. And I guess that goes back to my earlier point around managing expectations, and again being abundantly clear on your website, in your policies, you know, social media, wherever, that if you make an anonymous complaint, that's completely fine, and you might encourage those in certain circumstances, but that then as a regulator or oversight body, you can be limited in what you can do. And also that, you know, that individual may not ever find out what the outcome of making that complaint was. So I think that's another important aspect.
That's a great point. Andrew, can I throw to you for some closing thoughts? You know, if for the people listening, you know, what's the couple of takeaways for them that, you know, they should be thinking about or should be doing from your experience?
So I still think, I mean, and the topic was complain. I still think complaints are a really important source of identifying problems that may be coming up. They are absolutely the canary in the coal mine for us, and gives us a quick indication that something might be happening in the marketplace or in a workplace or in a licensed establishment, as is, you know, our regulatory world. But at the same time, it's no longer the only issue. So be careful that it doesn't become white noise or a distraction. More importantly, I think they can actually become a distraction to where the real harm is. And now it actually should be seen as an important part of a much broader intel piece, an analysis piece that we actually can get because of the data that we have access to, because of the technology that we have access to. So still really important, but let's look at it as part of a part of an ecosystem which is much bigger.
Great point. How about you, Nicole? What's the takeaways for people listening?
I agree with Andrew, you know, complaints are still really important. And I think I would like to reiterate again those earlier principles that I pointed out, that whether you're an oversight body, a regulator, an agency, they are fundamental principles for complaint handling, and I'd encourage you to have a look at our website to find those principles. But I think as well, something that we've touched on, but we haven't talked in great detail, is around the culture, and ensuring that whether it's an agency that you regulate or your own agency, that you have a culture from the top down that embraces complaints, that's not afraid of them, and that you send that very clear message, you know, to your staff, that complaints are not something that should be hidden away, and in fact, you know, surfacing them won't result in detriment, that won't result in, you know, any sort of retribution, and in fact will be acted upon where appropriate to do so. So, you know, sort of, and then acting, I guess, on those complaints, and demonstrably acting on those complaints, so that your customers and your staff can actually see that your product, your service, your process has been changed by those complaints.
I just want to also make mention, I should declare an interest. I've been involved with the Society of Consumer Affairs Professionals of Australia for many, many years. And they are sort of a group that's absolutely focused on complaint handling. And I know that they've had the support of the New South Wales Ombudsman and other ombudsmen in the past, as well as the Department of Customer Service. They run some great complaint handling work. They've also done some amazing research on the return of on investment for complaint handling, and specifically for us, they've actually there's finally a paper on the return of investment for public sector agencies. Normally, it's something that it's applied to the private sector, but it's something really worth looking at. Going to the SOCAP website and having a look at that that research that was done. In terms of what is the return on investment for the public sector. It's a social return, but nevertheless a really important piece of work, well worth having a look at.